Hello, welcome to the Executive Insights Podcast brought to you by AWS. My name is Tom Godden. I'm a Director of Enterprise Strategy here with AWS. And today I'm joined by Matt Fitzpatrick. Matt, thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction, explain to us a little bit more about your role at McKinsey, and please talk to me more about QuantumBlack Labs. Love the name.
So you can think of McKinsey engineering broadly as we have a couple thousand engineers that are at client sites building models, building technology, and QuantumBlack Labs is the kind of technology development group that supports all of that. So whether that's a retention model or a recommendation engine, and anything where you can think of it as a software interface that has a model that's leading to a decision. In a Gen AI context, that might be something like a chatbot. That's what our QuantumBlack team is doing. And then QuantumBlack Labs is all of the tools and product development that supports those forward deployed engineers.
So you're seeing a ton going on with AI right now. McKinsey, our customers always benefit a lot from the insights. I follow McKinsey a lot to gain insights. What are you seeing top of mind right now in the AI space?
Yeah, I think the last 2 years have been interesting because obviously AI has become more top of mind for a lot of people. It's the front page of every newspaper these days.
It's the cool kid in town.
But I think the reality of it has been more challenging than people expected. Yeah. I think that a lot of people expected it to be more like software where you'd install a new ERP system and it would work. And I think it's actually a lot more about experimentation and figuring out training. And so that process by which a lot of more traditional non-technology organizations who've only used really software and then maybe some modeling here and there have tried to pivot to being more of kind of technology development groups. And that means something very different. Like nobody was going to build custom software 25 years ago with their own mainframe. It would have been pretty hard. Yeah. But I think in this context, as you think about leveraging all the different technologies that you can kind of combine to then leverage, let's say, a Gen AI model, that's a very different process than most like enterprise Fortune 5,000 companies that have never really built before. The data we see would say that about 92% of models these days don't make it to production.
Really?
So only about 8% of what's being built today is being used. And I think that's been a hard adjustment process for most traditional companies.
So let's double click on that for a minute. What are some of the hurdles? What's holding people back from turning that to 80% instead of 8%?
Yeah, I think it's a couple different things. I think the most pronounced one is hallucinations in a Gen AI context, right? So machine learning, it's a little bit easier. You can say, here's my dependent variable. There's some level of accuracy I need, and you can get comfortable with that. In a Gen AI context, if you decide to build a model that doesn't necessarily have a clear definition, like let's say a chatbot to have discussions about what type of coffee someone would like to order. Defining what good looks like is actually pretty hard.
Yeah.
And so that
sounds easy.
And so I think a lot of organizations, if you think if they've got 100 pilots going on, they're not really sure what the mark is of, okay, this moves to production, this works. And so I think that definition of saying the KPI I'm going to measure is this, and here I'm going to bound it and test it and make sure that I'm comfortable that there's no risk happening. I think that's been the biggest one. And you have seen some really high profile public issues with that where organizations have released, a chatbot that did something pretty embarrassing. So I think that's been by far number one.
I think that's causing people to rightfully worry, but overreact a little bit, because rightfully so, they don't want to become that company that's being talked about on social media or on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
Completely agree. And by the way, the interesting thing about that is there are ways to do that with fairly high levels of conviction that you have managed the risk. It means like you put guardrails around things it can't say, things around bias, things around toxicity. You can put guardrails and you can say, look, this is the outcome I'm looking for is, this bound of recommendations. Or if you need to make a recommendation like, suggesting the purchase of this product or a price, you can actually have that governed by a very auditable, clear, transparent machine learning model, and then have the LLM be the wrapper that is the conversational kind of wrapper around that. And in that sort of a paradigm, there's very little risk. What your recommendation is going to be, and you can put guardrails around so it doesn't say anything particularly scary. But again, that's in the context of organizations that have never had to build anything like that before. And so I think that learning curve has been hard. I think the other components of it are, it requires a lot of organizational change to get comfortable with test and learn. I think that's the other hardest part about this. Like, I think most organizations that build technology want to know that in 6 months it will be at something where they know with certainty how it works.
Yeah, and this is unique because it's a living, breathing thing. It's going to continually evolve and change as the data that's feeding it and interacting with it changes. And I think that mindset, I think you hit on it, is just something that's so foreign to so many people, and rightfully so. I mean, it's understandable, but then I think they freak out a little bit on it, and don't know where to go.
Completely. I think if you've operated in a paradigm of software that works or models that are highly predictable, like basic statistical models, and then you suddenly have to move to test and learn, that is not easy, right? And think about even like something that, let's say, is going to empower, someone on your front lines, a Salesforce rep or a call center rep, and the idea that person's got to make a decision around something that might not be perfect right away. That's that's hard. And I think what has been interesting is if you get comfortable with that motion and you do the proper training and testing before you push it out live, you can get to a really good outcome. Yeah. But it's just not a muscle most organizations have.
So I'm going to bring you back a little bit. We talked about a few of the challenges. We'll talk a little bit more about it. But let's talk about the opportunities.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing companies leaning in and doing? What's some of the exciting things? And, the other one, Matt, where's the easy layup? I mean, give me the win. What's the win?
I think we're going to look back in 5 to 10 years and say that the first 2 years were much harder than people expected, but the change in 10 years from now is going to be much bigger than people expect in a lot of ways. And I think if you look across a couple different dimensions, coding, software development, I think
such a great use case to go after.
I mean, think about let's say 5 years ago, 8 years ago, if you wanted to start a company and build an app, you had to find somebody to build you a web page was actually painful to do. The idea of text to HTML, text to SQL, all of these things are going to dramatically democratize access to new technology development. And I think that will be a really positive change for society for anyone who wants to start a company. But it'll also make engineers much more effective. I mean, we already see many of our engineers already using a lot of Gen AI when they're developing it. It is more efficient in a lot of ways than just a code repository that you have to search through. And so I think we're already seeing, we're probably in inning 3 of software development improvement, but I think that'll probably be the area, in my opinion, that has the biggest impact over the next couple of years.
And one of the things I like about that is not only the immediate value that you're going to get for it, but it gets the mental gears going for the developers as they use generative AI for coding assistant to go, well, I wonder if I could also use that in customer service in this kind of way. And it also shows that we're talking about augmenting individuals, not replacing them. And so I think embodying all those things, and you get the coding benefit and value of it. I mean, I'm like, oh my gosh, go.
100%. Well, also think about the several $1 trillion of legacy software that exists across the world, right? And think about the pain for those organizations if you have an old system that's 20 years old, written on an old legacy code base.
Upgrade from this version of .NET to the next.
And it's a horrible experience for your customers. It's a horrible experience for your employees. And so imagine
it's non-differentiating, right? It's just work you got to get done so you can get onto the real stuff.
And that's what's really, I think, if you think about kind of the age of digital, that's what's prevented a lot of companies from really moving into that, is just these huge legacy code bases. So I think if you can move to a world where you can modernize those more efficiently and start to, allow your organization to become more digital first, that's going to have huge implications for, making more old school businesses feel a lot more like technology companies. So I do think that's going to be a real step change in a positive way for the way businesses function. Because anyone who's got, a 30-year-old system that they're trying to run their business off of knows that is an incredibly painful process to refactor. The other area that I think is material is customer experience. So anything that's around customer outreach, call centers, outbound emails, outbound texts. Right now that's a fairly painful process. I mean, we've seen, for example, the experience of call centers is the NPS scores on most call centers are not very good. Most people do not like the experience of waiting on hold for 25 minutes. So, imagine a world where rather than a routed directional flow that says you can only talk about billing or service, you can have a conversation and sort your issue. That's going to be, again, you're going to take the amount of time you spend on hold at call centers down very materially. Yeah. And your ability to outreach to your customers, to talk to them, that will be a really big change. Right now, if you send an outbound email, most of the time, it's a form letter about an event. But imagine if that outbound email knows things about the person's account. It can really give them a customized offer. I think that's a really material one. The other one that I think is very material is what I would call knowledge management. So think of any organization that has enormous amounts of data, whether that be let's say a claims processing business or a auto repair business, but it has lots of information that sits across it. that's really not organized or structured in any way. And so a lot of the time the wheel is reinvented every time anything's done, and there's no institutional memory, I guess I would say. I think that's one we see a lot of interest in that will be very
There's a
transformative.
great example on the AWS website about a company, elevators, escalators, that type of thing. And they've built a great AI solution on top of that on AWS to go back into the history of all of the service records that have gone on. So as you're there trying to repair this escalator or this elevator at a place, instead of reinventing the wheel, why can't you go back into the history of all the service calls that have ever existed and say, what's the way to be able to triage that? And that's just one example. And I think there's so many to leverage for that.
I think service calls is one of the best examples of this. I mean, if you think about how almost every organization on earth functions now with service calls, unless they have a really sophisticated call center system, they have an individual go make a decision, make an assessment, which may or may not be right. And then that is not stored or used in any way. And so we all as a society deal with a lot more pain around incorrect diagnoses at any point of service. And I think that will be a very positive thing as well.
So we lived through in 2023 and 2024, a little bit maybe of the hype of generative AI, the excitement, but it was a little bit of hype that came with it. I believe, and I think we believe here strongly at AWS, that over the fullness of time, we're going to see really almost every application augmented by AI and by generative AI. But given that as a backdrop, how do we still help leaders rationalize as they bring forward business cases on generative AI so they don't oversell it? You know, so that you find that correct value. How do you advise people to move forward in that?
So this goes a little bit to why only 8% are making it right now. And I do think the uncertainty of success is a tricky part in the business case development process here, right? What I mean by that is, like, let's say that you want to install a new software system to do any process, like expenses, right? Right now, you would build a business case and you'd know exactly the workflow it's going to do, and you'd have very high confidence. And so it's a very simple process to build a business case for that. But imagine your business case rests around like 12 different things where you could use your
solve for N,
where 5 of them might work and 7 of them might not work. And I think you actually have to change the way business case development works to look a lot more like venture capital. I don't think that means that only 1 in 10 work. I think it means that you've got to be comfortable experimenting, trying 10, 12, 14 different things. And over time, you'll get, in the first batch, you'll get 5 that work. And the next batch, you'll get 10 that work. You also won't be investing huge amounts to develop each one. The way I think of it is like, take knowledge management. The same data you use for that service call, as an example, you can probably use for contact centers. You can probably use for, document production about how the call went, all this kind of stuff. And so you'll end up with 5, 6, 7 use cases linked to the one you built that worked.
I love that. And I advise people all the time on it. Get that document summary use case maybe to work, but then use it in HR, use it in finance. You're going to have to tweak it and train the model a little bit, but you're 80% or 90% of the way there.
This has been the hard thing about business cases. You're not taking a paradigm where it's going to take you 2 years and it's one monolithic business case that at the end it's done. You're actually more of a paradigm of, I need to get 4 different data components for this use case. All of those data components are modular, and I can use them for 4 other use cases. And so actually my business case development is, does it seem worthwhile where I'm going to build enough capabilities and I can justify getting started because it will be useful for things repeatedly. And over time, on a 3-5 year basis, you're going to make multiples of your investment. It just may not be on the first one.
So Matt, let's pretend that I'm a CIO. I was a former CIO, so not a hard thing to pretend. And let's say I'm looking at a circumstance where I want something to be very unique, customized to me, but I also want it to be inexpensive, right? Isn't that always the paradigm? How is McKinsey, how are you approaching advising people build versus buy? When you build it, you get to customize it.
Yeah.
Costs a lot more. When you buy it, theoretically, less expensive, less customized. I, as CIO, I'm stuck in the middle now. Help me out. What advice do you give?
Yeah, I have this view that actually the definition of build versus buy has become very skewed in how we think about it as any technology organization. Here's what I mean by that. 10 years ago, the definition of build versus buy meant buy, I take something off the shelf and it works, and it costs me a certain amount. And in build case, to build, I would literally have to stand up a mainframe computer. I have to build all of my code largely from scratch, often in length. Maybe this is 15 years ago, but
build it all.
You are really building something from scratch, and your investment is going to be massive.
We appreciate you saying that, because that's a little bit of AWS's strategy. To help take that undifferentiated lifting.
Well, look, and I think if I take a broad view, not with any particular technology provider, today building means I spin up a cloud instance. I use various modular components. I pulled GitHub code repositories with information. I pull from 6 or 7 different off-the-shelf components that allow me to stand something up for a fraction of the cost it would have used 10 years ago. That's really useful and customized to my organization. And so 3 years ago, I was working with a player that was debating buying an off-the-shelf. It was a large asset manager, and they needed to rebuild their credit system. And their debate was, do I buy an off-the-shelf credit platform or do I build one? This is not a technology company. 10 years ago, the idea of building a credit platform would have seemed absolutely insane.
Alarm bells are going off.
Yeah, but when they ran through it, what they ended up realizing was, okay, to buy this, it's going to take me a very material investment to customize the data schema to match to the off-the-shelf credit platform. And then I'm going to need screens that look like they had a homegrown system they were trying to replace when they did this. It was going to take a ton of investment to customize the off-shelf system to look like what they wanted. It was going to take a ton of investment to map the data to it. And so by the time they were done,
what's
they were
the end game?
Basically building a new system on this kind of off-the-shelf system. So their other option was take all the modern tooling that exists, right? Modern data tooling, modern kind of cloud infrastructure, all that, and just stand up a system. And that actually ended up, crazy enough, not being more expensive than using it. And we're seeing that more and more. I think Gen AI is going to really accelerate that, because one of the things I've loved about the Gen AI ecosystem is how interoperable all the different applications are. Nobody is building this to say, you can only use ours. Everyone is saying you can participate best of breed. And so any new tech that comes out, you're going to be able to participate in. And so the question then becomes, if you want to build a new credit application today and you buy something and then some new interesting Gen AI tool comes along, you can't use that. You've actually got more tech debt by using the 10-year-old off-the-shelf credit platform than you would if you built a modern, interoperable, evergreen stack and allow you to use all the modern components. I will say the number of companies that have gotten comfortable with building, as you might call it today, is way higher than it was 5 years ago. And it's all the investment in cloud and infrastructure that allows it to be so much faster.
So Matt, you've done a lot of transformations. You've led a lot. You've seen a lot. McKinsey talks a lot about rewiring organizations to be able to do this. What are you seeing is successful models for how people are approaching that cultural aspect to help succeed as we move into this generative AI?
I think a couple different things have been key for that. One is being very clear on what use cases actually matter and can move the needle. Because I think, again, if you take a 10-year ago view where you might have your tech organization not really talking to your business organization, that is surefire failure. You need a clear view of what's my vision? What are the 10 use cases I'm going to try out? How are my tech teams and business teams going to work together to test and learn? That whole process is a new muscle. I think the skill set we're seeing the most interest in these days is what you might call like a translator skill set, or somebody who's kind of digitally knowledgeable but also understands the business. I've worked with a bunch of real estate clients, for example, and somebody who understands both tech and the real estate industry is way more valuable than someone who understands one or the other. I think you need to have the link between the tech organization and the business teams so that what's being built is workable and relates to what the business users want. So I think the kind of translator skill set is really important. I also do think you have to think a lot about kind of reskilling, or at least the technical skill set of your engineering organization. If you have an engineering organization that doesn't know how to use Python, or even things like Rust that are a little bit newer, it's going to be harder for you to take advantage of kind of a lot of the modern Gen AI tooling. And so what that may lead is kind of retraining, reskilling, things like that, or new hires, but you're going to have to augment your traditional engineering organization.
So you talked a little bit earlier about 10 years from now, we're going to look back on these first 2 years a little bit harder. Where are we in 10 years? Where are we going?
Here's a positive view that I think, there's obviously been a lot of controversy in some ways around what it could look like in 10 years, but I'll give you the positive spin. So we all spend a ton of time right now on our phones. If you think about the amount of time you spend on your phones, and then the prevalence of reports and documents that everyone spends their life on. It's enormous, right? Everyone has 1,000 custom reports, spreadsheets, all this kind of stuff, paired with 1 to 2 hours of screen time per day, usually looking down and out of the real world. Now imagine a world where that gets replaced. And by the way, a lot of that relates to the prevalence of different apps or tools you use to manage, flight bookings, or, any different component of your life, you have a different app to do it. Now imagine a world where you don't need 1,000 apps, spreadsheets. You have, let's say, some sort of glasses or things like that where you're actually in the real world walking around. You start to see alerts on those glasses. By the way, these already exist, so I'm not actually saying anything that revolutionary. But then you pair that with the virtual assistant in your ear. And now let's say you're a CEO in that world. Rather than walking through 17 different reports every day that show different things and all that, you're just asking, your assistant, you're saying, for me. Show me my sales in Europe and how they split by customer and these 5 cuts. And you see that on the side of your glasses. And then you walk by and you say, oh, that's an interesting ad. Who made that? You can actually start to interact with the world. Science fiction is often the best predictor of that. And there are various indications of that you see in the science fiction world.
The Simpsons, right?
Exactly. But in science fiction, you have various kind of librarians or characters that you interact with that actually just start to tell you the information you need whenever you need it. I think that's the optimistic view where this actually gives all of us a lot more times in our day. Like, imagine if you take all the time you spend sitting in traffic right now and you're sitting in a driverless car, operating in a world where you can ask for any information you want. That creates tons of opportunities to start new businesses, to build new products. And I think that's going to be really exciting. So
in closing here, what's your one piece of advice for someone about to start on this journey? You have a lot of experience in this. What's the one takeaway you give them? I do have one really specific piece of advice. So there's an interesting study I'd read recently that with the advent of Gen AI, you actually have seen decreased interest in kind of computer science. You've seen an interesting spike where basically in 2006 onward, computer science really rose. And then there's been kind of pessimism that there'll be less interest in that because Gen AI is going to solve this all. I think that is the furthest from the truth. I actually think an engineering mind will find hundreds of ways to take advantage of this. And so my advice to anyone— My wife will be happy about this.
Well, my advice for anyone thinking about this is think about ways to study and learn more about this. And so whether that means you've been working for 20 years and you're thinking about going back to some advanced learning at a more advanced age, or you're in college, in all of those cases, I think an engineering skill set becomes the future of everything. And your ability to really create things from that, even if you're not always the one writing hands-on keys coding, is going to massively evolve over time. So that would be my main comment.
I love doing these because I always learn something new. I learned a lot from you here today, Matt. Thank you so much for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom, for having me.